I get a few answers to that. Tell you why the topic occurred to me. If you remember the last discussion I had about this little town in Poland, last time we met, there was a young man there who was enamored of the United States, hoped to migrate to the US, learned English, began teaching the man I wrote about and some of his friends English in anticipation of moving away from Kolbashova and to the United States. And then he wrote a letter to Elinor Roosevelt asking if she could somehow pave the way, expedite his entry into the United States. This is in the 1930s when things are tightening up, as you know. And what shocked me when I heard that he actually got an answer back from Elinor Roosevelt, and I was amazed that, first of all, I was wondering, how do you send a letter? I mean, how do you address it to Elinor Roosevelt? And doing a little research for this discussion, I found out that all you had to do was write Elinor Roosevelt, USA, and it got to her. And she received.
That's supposed to all be.
Yeah, at that time it worked pretty well, right?
No
So,
computer.
Yeah. In any event, he got a letter back, and which, as I said, astonished me until I learned that she was like a letter machine. She received thousands. Her first year as First Lady in 1933, she got 130,000 letters. Needless to say, she had secretaries to respond, but she apparently looked over all of them, and there was a certain personal dimension to it. I assume she signed them. In any event, that got me interested in Elinor Roosevelt. And then many of you know that I wrote a history of Central Synagogue in behalf of its, let's see, its 60th, 60th, 1936 to 1990 to 2016. So what does that make? Whatever it was.
80.
And in the, okay, thanks. I couldn't do the math very quickly. In the course of it, probably many of you know that Elinor Roosevelt came and spoke at Central Synagogue in connection with the formal opening of the sanctuary in 1955, I think. And again, I was amazed, you know, a woman, at that point, she was known around the world, a first-class personality, and yet she ended up in Rockville Center at the Central Synagogue. There was a time that there were people around who probably went to that gathering. Today, I asked Buddy Meyer the other day. I knew Buddy was alive back then, but Buddy said he was a kid and he doesn't remember. So the point being, she was there. We have pictures of it, but no one is now around who can recall what she said or what the circumstances were like. And then the other reason is strictly an academic one. You may know that certainly within the last generation or two, women's history has become a prime subject for serious academic research. As the women's movement took hold, as with any movement, there's always an effort to try to write the history to provide a basis for the current concern. And therefore, women's history, or as often the women prefer to call it, herstory, became a major area of historical research. And finally, I've got to admit, I'm a historian, but I didn't know all that much about Elinor Roosevelt other than the obvious facts of her being a first lady and being a world-class citizen after that. We overlapped in terms of I was alive when she was alive, but did not pay more than cursory attention. So for me, it was an undertaking that would allow me to learn more about this woman, who I discovered was absolutely extraordinary. If one were to simply put together all her references and her writings and her speeches, it would be a book in itself. I mean, the bibliography is enormous. And there have been a number of biographies, and continue to be, and I'll try to draw from what I learned from them. So here's what we'll do. I'm going to start by outlining rather rapidly her general career, what she did, how her life proceeded, and then we'll kind of burrow in and look at the kind of person she was. What was she like? And then finally, in the third section, summing up, you know, what were her principal achievements? Why should she be remembered today? So to get going, she was born in 1884 to an aristocratic family, the Roosevelts, Dutch ancestry, among others, going back to the foundation of New Amsterdam in the 17th century. Her father was a Livingston. No, I take that back. Her mother was a Livingston. And they too go back to the revolutionary generation. So it is one of the, I mean, that's why she was a member of the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution. The family goes back that far. Her father, Elinor's father, was the brother of Teddy Roosevelt. And if you've read or looked at Ken Burns's documentary, you know, there was the Oyster Bay Roosevelts. I'm sure many of you have visited the house. And then there were the Hyde Park Roosevelts. And while they were family, there was a fair amount of rivalry between them. In fact, one historian referred to them as hissing cousins. A point, in fact, here in 1924, Elinor campaigned for Governor Al Smith, or for Al Smith, who wanted to become governor, while at the same time, the son of Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican competing against Al Smith. So in a sense, the family feud expressed itself with Elinor campaigning against a relative. Now, they were part of what we would call the WASP elite back at the latter part of the 19th century. In fact, this was the time that the upper classes coalesced. You may have heard the term the 400. This was a term made up by a guy who fancied himself as a commentator on the aristocrats of New York. And he said, there are 400 people in New York who truly deserve to be part of this upper crust. His name was Ward McAllister, and the 400 has become a kind of a benchmark when we think of upper classes. We select 400. This was an era of country clubs, of private schools, of finishing schools, of prep schools, of debutante balls, of charity balls, the Ivy League. This was when the upper class became a truly organized strata of society, doing a lot of intermarrying and a high level of self-consciousness. Part of that was associated with what we might call noblesse oblige. If you're upper class, you enjoy all the benefits of being upper class, but you feel a certain sense of obligation to the lower classes. So we find Elinor at this point going down to Rivington Street on the Lower East Side. Many of you probably know about the settlement house movement. When the immigrants came, at least to New York City, latter part of the 19th, early part of the 20th century, there was great fear that they would overrun the city, that they were living in poverty, bred disease, crime, etc. So the upper classes took it upon themselves to try to civilize and to try to tutor and to try to be of great assistance. And therefore, the settlement house movement began. You probably remember Hull House in Chicago. Well, there were comparable settlement houses on the Lower East Side, and there still are. There still are. So Elinor went down there along with a lot of her upper crust friends and engaged with the population there. She taught dancing, she taught calisthenics, but more importantly, she went into the homes of these people. A lot of them worked in sweatshops in their homes doing sewing. If you go to the Tenement House Museum on the Lower East Side, you can get a flavor of what that was all about. But here you have Elinor Roosevelt going down to the Lower East Side, engaging with these people, seeing the way they live, and that kind of informs much of what she's going to do later on in life. She became a member, her friends formed the Junior League, which you probably know about. They still exist, and again, essentially, it was upper class, unmarried women, although maybe married as well, who took on this obligation to be of assistance and to try what they would call uplift. So this is clearly a case of a woman belonging to the upper class, to the WASPs, but they were worried at the same time that they were helping these immigrants. They were concerned that these immigrants, being very fertile, coming over in large numbers, would essentially swamp the WASP elite and threaten their position in society. There was a number of authors who wrote about, there was a famous book in 1915 by Madison Grant called The Passing of a Great Race. They actually were talking about race suicide, believe it or not, in response to the pouring in of immigrants. And, you know, we have a little smattering of it, maybe not such a little smattering of it today when we speak of, you know, white privilege being threatened by people of color. Well, it goes back to this period as well. So ironically, they were complaining that the immigrants were having too many children. It turns out that Elinor herself had 6 children, and her uncle Teddy Roosevelt, had 6 children. So they were doing all they could to kind of balance off the immigrant fertility. And I should say, as a member of the upper class, they express the same degree of anti-Semitism. If you remember, I gave a talk some time ago on anti-Semitism, and I pointed out that just as some particularly German Jews were rising in society and becoming successful, the WASP upper class did all it could to keep them out, to make sure these arrivists, these nouveau riches, did not penetrate their social strata. I pointed to a famous or notorious case of the banker Joseph Seligman, who tried to take his family to Saratoga Springs in 1877 to the Grand Union Hotel and was told that there was no place for Jews here. So the reason I bring this up is that at the beginning, Elinor expressed the same reservations about the Jews as did fellow members of the upper class. She quoted, I have a quote from her where she says, "The Jews are very unlike ourselves." And then she wrote to her mother, "I never wish to hear money, jewels, or sables mentioned again," after she went to a party where Jews were in attendance. So first point to keep in mind about Elinor, clearly a member of the WASP elite, for better or for worse, the better part of it being her sense of obligation, the Junior League, the Settlement House, During World War I, she worked in a Red Cross canteen at the Union Station in Washington, D.C., helping out the troops. So she is kind of fulfilling the obligations of her upper class. The next category, the next piece of her life is early tragedy. I mean, when you hear what she went through, it's a wonder that she survived it. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the fact that early on, her mother died, her brother died soon thereafter, and shortly after that, her father died. Her father was what they would call at that time a sportsman, really had no particular vocation. He drank heavily. He was mentally unstable. They brought him to one sanitarium after another in Europe. He threatened suicide. He impregnated one of their domestics. He was, Teddy Roosevelt tried to, in fact, after he impregnated one of the housekeepers, she gave birth to a boy. And for years, Teddy Roosevelt supported that boy after the father passed away. So here we have Elinor orphaned at 10 years old. No mother, no father, a brother gone, left with only one other brother at that time. She's given private tutoring, and then she's sent off, as many upper class young girls were sent off to finishing school. I imagine you've probably heard that term. Where upper class girls are supposed to learn etiquette and formal behavior, a smattering of education, but to make them suitable as wives for upper class men. This episode, she was in a finishing school in Wimbledon, England, right outside of London. The school was known as Allenswood, and she spent 3 years there, and she concedes it was the pivotal point of her life. Why was that the case? Because there was at the time, and maybe Joy can put her up on the screen, a Marie Silvestre, a headmistress there, who was, by all accounts, an extraordinary woman. That's her. And she took Elinor under her wing, in addition to the finishing school studies. She taught her, and she learned French and Italian. She later learned German. She was linguistically very astute. She took her with her on trips during vacation periods. In other words, Marie Silvestre took her under her wing, gave her self-confidence, and as Elinor later said, these were the pivotal years of my life. And she kind of begins the long climb back after her disastrous early childhood. So she returns to the United States after this finishing school period, and she goes on the debutante circuit, which is what was expected. And one day, heading out to, I think, to Hyde Park on the train, she runs into a family member, Franklin Roosevelt, who is at that time, I think, yes, he's going to Columbia Law School. He was a Harvard graduate, was going to Columbia Law School, and they begin to engage with one another. He was her fifth cousin, and they fall in love. A serious, sincere, deeply felt relationship, but it was threatened. It was threatened by Franklin's mother. Franklin, I must tell you, was a mama's boy. She would remind him to put his galoshes on. Even later in life, when he became president, she listened in to his conversations. She was quite the commanding, stern 19th century Victorian woman who brooked no nonsense. And she tried as best she could to keep Franklin and Elinor from getting together. She sent Franklin away, hoping that would cool the romance. It did not. And so in 1905, they are wed on St. Patrick's Day. Why St. Patrick's Day? Because her uncle, Teddy, was coming in for the parade, and they said, wouldn't it be nice if Teddy could be in New York City and marry them off, walk her down the aisle, which he did. And then they had their party at the Waldorf Astoria, which must have been very nice, except Elinor reports that, you know, she was the bride, but no one paid very much attention to her because Teddy Roosevelt was in the wedding party and everyone flocked around Teddy and pretty much ignored her. So they are married in 1905. And then I've got to tell you, the mother, Franklin's mother, intervenes once again, and she buys and restores and renovates 2 townhouses, 47 East 65th and 49 East 65th. The buildings are still there. They were eventually, upon the death of Sarah, they were given to Hunter College. Hunter College now uses them, but nonetheless, keeping her claws in Franklin. And of course, Franklin goes along with this. She invites him and of course his new wife to move in with her in the adjoining townhouse on 65th Street. She decorates both houses for them. And more to the point, she has constructed a passageway so that one can easily move between her townhouse and their townhouse. This begins, or shall we say, continues a long-standing feud between Sarah and Elinor because Sarah tried to run her life. Franklin did not intervene very strenuously, and this would plague Elinor down through the years. And Elinor, as you will see, will take certain moves to try to mitigate and avoid it. But right from the get-go, you've got the makings of a conflict given the question of the residence. So Elinor now does what women then and since generally do. She begins to have children. And over the next 10 years, she has 6 children, 5 boys, 1 girl. 1 boy dies after 3 months. So we're talking about 4 boys and 1 girl, Anna. Elinor does not consider herself a very good mother. She considers herself inadequate. She's nervous. She's insecure. So who raises the children? As you might expect, Sarah intervenes continuously. And of course, there are nurses to fill in. And Elinor concedes that Franklin is much better with the boys and with all the kids actually than she was. And she never denies that she was notably inadequate as a mother. And as you'll later see, and as some of you may know, she was rather disappointed in her children, and she expressed it on many occasions. So what's Franklin doing at this point? Well, he leaves Columbia Law School, gets a job as a lawyer down at Wall Street, and now has political aspirations. In 1910, he's elected to the state Senate. He's reelected in 1912, and then he enters the Wilson administration as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, just like his uncle Teddy, who was Assistant Secretary of the Navy under McKinley. So there we are through the 1910-1918 period with Elinor raising children and Franklin embarking on a political career, which will, as you will see, peak initially in 1920, when he is selected to run as vice president on the Democratic ticket, along with Cox, so that he rises rapidly and his future looks very bright. But 1918 is a major turning point in their lives. They had both gone off to Europe. This is at the end of the World War I. He is Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He is going to check out the conditions in Europe. He contracts what appears to be the flu. Remember, there's the flu epidemic in that year. We've been reminded of it all too often in recent months. So he's not feeling well. So when they come back, Elinor unpacks his valises. And in one of the valises, she discovers love letters from Lucy Mercer Rutherford. Love letters from Lucy to Franklin. Who was Lucy, you might say? Lucy was the social secretary of Elinor, obviously had close contact with Franklin, and an affair developed. In fact, to show you the rivalry among the Roosevelts, Alice Roosevelt, the daughter of Teddy Roosevelt, did all she could to encourage the affair between Franklin and Lucy, almost as if an element of revenge there. In any event, there's an enormous blow up, as you might expect. Franklin seems to be in love with Lucy, does talk about divorce. And Sarah says, if you divorce Elinor, you will be cut off. I will cut you off. You know, she held the purse strings. And then others said, you know, you could never marry Lucy because she's a Catholic and it just won't happen. And then others say, if you divorce Elinor and marry Lucy, or even don't marry Lucy, your political career will effectively come to an end. So after all is said and done and all is worked out, they agree to stay together. But of course, it will never be the same in terms of marital relations. Though later on, one of their sons, Jimmy Roosevelt, said, and I quote, "The truth of the matter is that a deep, unshakable affection and tenderness existed between them for the rest of their years." In other words, they had a strange relationship, and I'll define what that consisted of. But they still had great affection for each other. There were reports in the White House that he was always patting her fanny when she came by. So they liked each other. I guess they didn't love each other. And later on, in about 1938, Elinor was going through Franklin's love letters, and it was too painful to her, so she destroyed them. So I guess symbolically, that tells us something. And I should say FDR, as part of this, quote, settlement, agreed not to see Lucy Mercer again, but he didn't keep his word. There were clandestine meetings over the years. Lucy did marry someone else who then died prematurely. And one of the saddest and hurtful things was when FDR died at Warm Springs in April of 1945, Elinor was not there, but Lucy was. So that is one of the watershed moments in Elinor and Franklin's life. But in a sense, as you'll see, it was a springboard for Elinor to move off in another direction. And then the second turning point happened shortly thereafter. And many of you probably know about this if you saw the movie years ago called Sunrise at Campobello. Campobello was an island off the coast of Maine, actually, I think in New Brunswick, Canada, where they had a summer home. And they happened to be there in 1921, as you know, and Franklin is stricken while there with polio. And I mean, that essentially defines that man for the rest of his life. He battled heroically, and thank you, Joy. Here is a picture of them at Campobello prior to his being stricken. They loved it there, and Elinor would be heroic in nursing him back, or trying to nurse him back to some level of competence. He would never be able to walk again unaided without braces. Remarkable thing is that he kind of got away with it. Reporters back then were much more discreet, obviously, than they are today. They were told never to photograph him below the waist, and therefore he always put himself in. I mean, people knew about it, but didn't know the extent of his incapacity. And there are some marvelous pictures. He founded a facility in Warm Spring, Georgia, where he thought warm baths would help people stabilize and maybe walk a little bit. There are pictures of him cavorting in the water with all of those who went down there to try to get the cure. He was a poster boy for polio. In fact, started the, what's the association that raised funds for polio?
March of Dimes.
March of Dimes, exactly. With his friend Basil O'Connor, he started the March of Dimes program, which of course all of you are aware of. So here we have Franklin stricken with polio, and that gives Sarah, his mother, I mean, I can't say she savored that, but she said, okay, Franklin, forget your political career, it's over. Why don't you simply retire, become a country gentleman? We've got money enough, and that's how you should spend the rest of your life in leisure. And I guess that was an option, but of course, as you know, it didn't happen. Along with Elinor and others, Franklin had a confidant by the name of Louis Howe, who was by his side all the time. Louis Howe was a New York Herald reporter who was kind of his political guide as he tried to move up politically, as he ran for vice president in 1920. And Louis Howe kind of gets the ear of Elinor and says to her, look, it's not the end of the line. We can still carve out a political career. Maybe he'll get better, maybe he won't, but he's of sound mind. He's a very forward-looking guy. He's popular. Let's see if we can make a career out of it, but you've got to help. And Elinor says, look, you know, the marriage is not going anyplace. He's now incapacitated. Their sex lives are over for a variety of reasons. And therefore, Elinor is sold on the idea that she can be his eyes and ears to the public. She can get out there, keep his name in the public limelight, make a career for herself. And she agrees to be tutored by Louis Howe as to what it takes to develop a political following, to keep your name in the paper, to do all the things that would benefit Franklin if his political career is to go any place. And so the 1920s is a pivotal period for Elinor, in as much as she gets out to the public. She joins one organization after another, union organizations, the League of Women Voters, and most critically, she participates in Al Smith's campaign for governor in 1924, and he wins, and it kind of vindicates the fact that she kind of learns and knows what needs to be done. She becomes a public speaker. She had always been rather shy and withdrawn, and now Elinor comes out in a way that no one really could have anticipated. The 1920s is also a period, remember, women get the vote in 1920, the notion of an independent woman, women who no longer need to depend on husbands, who don't get married. Many of them actually are lesbians who find pleasure in the company of other women. And Elinor begins to associate with these kinds of women who inspire her to make use of her talents. And Elinor didn't feel, look, Elinor never went to college. And she always felt a bit defensive because she had never had a college degree. And at one point she writes in this period, and I quote, "I have no talents, no experience, no training for anything. I doubt if I could make a very good cleaning woman." So she has her doubts, and these women encourage her. She hangs out with them. They're very accomplished professional women. One of them was a famous war correspondent whose name you may have heard in some connection, Martha Gellhorn. She became for a while the wife of Ernest Hemingway. She became friends with Amelia Earhart. You remember Amelia Earhart, the pilot. In fact, Amelia Earhart took Elinor up in a plane and encouraged her to get a pilot's license. But Franklin said, "This is going too far. You might get your license, but I don't want you flying in a plane. That's going too far." Also in the 1920s, remember, Elinor is still smarting when she goes to Hyde Park or when she goes to New York. There is Sarah. Sarah is alive and well and domineering as ever. And Elinor says, look, Elinor says it's becoming increasingly uncomfortable, and she gets the approval of Franklin to build a house for herself on the grounds of Hyde Park. It's called Valkill. You can still visit it now. It's part of the historic register. And what was Valkill? Well, it was two things. On one hand, it was a social experiment. Elinor is always doing this, attempting to see if she could encourage home crafts, woodworking, weaving, trying to give farmers in the area another source of livelihood when, of course, the planting and the harvesting season was over and winters were very tough. You know, farmers always had it tough. Where was the source of income for them in the winter months? And she thought by creating this crafts and this domestic manufacturing, she could provide an alternative and a fill-in in their income flow. So Valkill and another building on Valkill was a kind of small manufacturing facility which had its moments, but never lived up to the prospects that Elinor had wished. But the other part of the Valkill story was that this was Elinor's sanctuary. She could get away from Sarah. She could get away from Hyde Park. She could hide out at Valkill. She could invite all of her friends to hang out with her. And they had a marvelous time together. She speaks about pillow fights and hugging and kissing. These were women who were very, very friendly and loving toward each other. So this was her home away from home. This brings us to 1928 when Franklin runs for governor of New York. Even though Al Smith lost New York State, remember Al Smith runs for president in 1928, he loses New York State, but in part thanks to Elinor, Franklin wins the governorship and serves 2 terms as governor of New York. And this is another pivotal time in Elinor's career, because now she becomes his eyes and ears. He teaches her, interestingly, how to visit and inspect state facilities of all sorts. She becomes a keen observer. She reports back to the governor what she found. He then makes policy based on that. And so she becomes his eyes and ears. She goes out into the field, whereas he, of course, is limited in his ability to do so. She gains self-confidence, and therefore those 4 years with Franklin as governor also advances the abilities and the self-confidence of Elinor. We now move to 1932. You know what happens there. He is elected president. And surprisingly enough, Elinor goes into a fit of depression, fearing that she had been out there while governor. Now the obligations, the duties of a first lady would keep her chained to the White House. And that's something she really had relatively little interest in doing. But instead, given what she had done while he was governor, she now also serves that same function. She becomes his eyes and ears, and she is encouraged. One of the women who she is very much connected to, an Associated Press reporter who is an extraordinary reporter by the name of Lorena Hickok. They become, and again, as you'll see, this becomes a source of historical controversy. Were they lovers? Were they connected in various ways? They were inseparable for a time. Lorena Hickok and Elinor Roosevelt, when they were separated, Elinor wrote 10, 12-page letters to Lorena. It was an extraordinary relationship going on for several years, as I will later explain. In any event, Lorena encourages Elinor to get out there, to write a column, to have press conferences in order to carve out a new role for the First Lady. And Elinor begins to write a column called My Day, which she will write from the early 1930s daily through her passing in 1962. If you get on YouTube, if you're ever interested, you can see all of the My Day columns that Elinor Roosevelt wrote. Helping Roosevelt, in a sense, another woman comes into Franklin's life, Missy Leavitt. Missy, or Margaret Leavitt. She becomes his secretary. She becomes his wife. She becomes his domestic. She becomes his everything. Missy Leavitt. Obviously, Elinor's of two minds about this. On the one hand, you know, she is being replaced, but then again, she never really fulfilled the wifely obligations since 1918. On the other hand, because Missy Leavitt takes care of all of Franklin's needs, this frees Elinor up to do what she preferred to do, is to be out there, to be this new kind of First Lady. What do we mean by new kind of First Lady? A little backup here. In 1932, the last year of the Hoover administration, there is a march of 40,000 veterans and their families on Washington, demanding that they be paid their bonus that was promised them as World War I veterans. Yes, the bonus was to be paid, but not in 1932, later on. But they want it now, given the deprivations they are suffering because of the Depression. Well, Hoover gets scared. They camp out. They threaten. Remember, there are 40,000 of them camping out outside of the White House grounds and in Washington, D.C. So what he does is he sends the army out under MacArthur. You remember MacArthur, or you will remember him from World War II. And they drive these bonus marches out. Some are wounded, a few of them are killed. and it kind of represented the harsh policy of the Hoover administration in a time of need. Well, the reason I bring this up is that the following year, there is another March on Washington by veterans, somewhat smaller one, also demanding that they be paid their bonuses in advance. This time, instead of sending out the army, they send out Elinor Roosevelt, and she goes among them, she talks to them, she sings with them. They take to her in a way that one was totally surprised. And while she did not get them their bonuses, she promised them when the Civilian Conservation Corps got underway, she would give them first crack at gaining entry into the CCC. They accepted that. They were, in fact, brought into the CCC. So the reason I bring it up is that whereas Hoover sent the troops, Franklin Roosevelt actually sent Elinor, although it was Lewis's Howe's idea that that would be a good thing to do. So here is Elinor as the new kind of first lady traveling all over the country. And one of the remarkable things she did, and there's a picture here for it, she held press conferences for women only, for women reporters only. Here is a picture with Elinor Roosevelt and her women reporters. During her time as First Lady, she held 348 separate press conferences for women. Now, she did this for women because she said, if I only hold press conferences for women, then the newspaper will have to employ women as reporters in order to get the latest information, and therefore they will keep them on the staff, and therefore there will be jobs for women and women reporters. So that is another dimension, including writing a daily column, newspapers, which were carried, I think, in 62, thank you, Joy, 62 different newspapers, her press conferences, and as you will see, she was an advocate for virtually every liberal cause you can imagine. And what gives her leverage is she has her husband's ear. They may not be married in the conventional sense, but he trusted her. He understood that when she came back with reports, she was so excited. She'd go out in the field. She couldn't wait to have dinner with Franklin in order to report what she had seen. Often he was busy. Often he said, Elinor, I can't be busy with that now. But she would pester him, she would badger him, and eventually he would sit down and listen to what she had observed. So that is partially creating a new and expanded role for the First Lady. And I must say, no one else before or since has ever been the kind of First Lady she was. I mean, you can talk about Jackie and you can talk about Michelle, and you might like them. Of course you like them. But on the other hand, their roles would be largely constricted, and therefore Elinor stands alone in expanding the role of the First Lady. Of course, part of it had to do with the incapacity of Franklin Roosevelt. All right, let's move on to World War II, 1940. What Elinor attempts to do in the 1940s until 1945 is to try to keep the New Deal programs alive. That's a complicated story, but the New Deal had changed the lives of millions of Americans. Many of the programs began to lapse, and Elinor tried to do what she could to keep them going and expand them in ways that I can talk about later on. In addition, of course, war is pending in Europe, and Elinor is quite instrumental in a number of ways. One, as you may know, the British are trying to evacuate their children either to other countries, fearing an invasion by Germany. England is taking their kids sending them to the north of England in part, but also sending them to the Commonwealth and also sending them to the United States. Elinor becomes very involved in trying to get the US State Department to agree to bring these kids over. She runs a publicity campaign across the country asking for families to agree to house these kids, and she gets thousands of letters. I think there was a group of kids who came to Long Island during this period. In any event, what you should know, or maybe do know already, there was in the State Department an anti-Semite of the highest order by the name of Breckinridge Long, who did his best to block the entry and to block the visas of immigrants, particularly Jews, from getting into the United States in this period. Elinor is outraged. She calls him a fascist. She says, Franklin, you got to do something about this. And Franklin finally says, okay, I'm going to take care of it. He calls his Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, and he says, tell Breckinridge Long he's got to cool it here, let these kids in. And they are brought in under a visitor's visa, and therefore they do an end run around Breckinridge Long. So Elinor succeeds in bringing these kids over for the duration of the war. But of course, there are the Jews, and there are many who are prepared to support the Jewish children to enter the United States. But here she runs into, you know the story, at least partially, the level of anti-Semitism, the fear of, the argument you heard in 1940 is that if you let in immigrants, forget kids, if you let in immigrants, they're all going to be fifth columnists. They're going to undermine the United States, and therefore we can't take the risk of letting them in. Well, they're kids. Well, it doesn't matter. We don't want any of them in. And as a result, and Elinor says this was the greatest frustration, the greatest defeat in her life, she fails to change the hearts and minds and procedures of the State Department, and she is unable to get these Jewish children into the United States. On the other hand, there is another famous incident respecting this where she does succeed. All of you know, of course, about the St. Louis story, about that ship that came to Cuba with over 900 refugees on board, and ultimately are turned away and brought back to Europe. Well, there was another ship with a similar cargo of refugees coming out of Portugal. Interestingly, the name of the ship was the Kwanzaa, and it too faced the same circumstance. It landed, I think, in Costa Rica first. Many of them on board did have legitimate visas, and when that ship came to Norfolk, Virginia, to refuel, they were admitted into the United States. But there were 83 Jews whose papers were insufficient or improper, and they would not be allowed to disembark. And this became a whole to-do. Lawyers were summoned. They tried to hold up the ship, try to do something to prevent the ship from taking off back to Europe. Elinor is called upon to intervene, and she does successfully. And these 83 Jews are allowed to leave the Kwanzaa, and you can chalk that up as one of her successes, even though, as I said, she was terribly despondent with respect to the Jewish children. To show you the kind of person she was, I think you're getting the idea already. When the Japanese are interned after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Elinor thinks this is an atrocity. She opposes it. She goes out to California to try to do something about it. She incurs the hostility. Again, there's irrationality going on, there's panic going on, there's fear of the Japanese, there's revenge because of Pearl Harbor. She goes out there to try to advocate for the Japanese who are being interned. She doesn't get very far, but during the period when they are interned at the various camps, she intervenes, again, to know the story, they were let out in the intervening years. They were not all kept there for the 4 years of the war. They began to be let out under certain circumstances to go to college, to get scholarships. Elinor got them scholarships, and she also intervened to allow them to volunteer for the U.S. Army. So a rather interesting intervention with regard to the Japanese internment. During the war, she also advocates strongly for women to be allowed to work in the factories. You know, we know Rosie the Riveter, but by and large at the beginning, they did not want women to do factory work. They wanted them to do the traditional office work, secretarial work. Elinor and others said, no, they have the capacity and the will and the better pay to go into the factories. And eventually, as you know, they did. There is another major event during the war that Elinor is prominent in. The blacks, the African Americans, were being kept out of factory jobs. And even when they got them, they got much lower pay than their fellow white workers. And A. Philip Randolph, the head of the Sleeping Car Porters Union, threatens a march on Washington unless this is remedied. And of course, during the war, to threaten the march on Washington would have been extremely disruptive. He threatened to bring 100,000 blacks to Washington to protest. He and Elinor are friends. She intervenes with Franklin. They have a meeting at the White House with Walter White of the NAACP, of A. Philip Randolph, Elinor, the president, and others. And he agrees to sponsor the Fair Employment Practices Commission, in which they mandate that blacks get jobs and that they get equal pay. So that's another prominent event during her period of the war. After the war, she visits the refugee camps in Europe, and from 1945 on, she becomes a prominent figure in the United States, in the world, with her lecturing. She becomes a delegate to the United Nations. Truman appoints her. She becomes one of the architects of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She writes books, columns, speeches, extraordinary. She is probably the best known woman on the international and national stage. So that is her career in a nutshell. Absolutely extraordinary. The dimensions of her involvement and what she did went far beyond what I had even imagined. But before I tell you a little bit about what she was like and some of the issues surrounding her, I'm wondering, do any of you have any thoughts or questions or comments about her career in general? Yeah, Barbara?
I think she was just amazing that in this day and age, a woman's got to have Zoom, a woman's got to have the laptop and all this. She did everything with her mind and soul, and just amazing, just amazing.
Yeah, it is. I mean, she was like a one-man industry. Thousands of speeches. I mean, as I said, she came to Central Synagogue. I said, my God, you know, she made time for us, but it seems like she made time for everybody. And she traveled everywhere. She flew, she drove, she was in trains. She was a dynamo. Of course, I'll also tell you that she went to bed around 3 or 4 a.m. and she got up around 7 to 8 a.m. So she didn't sleep very much. And that, I guess, partially explains the fact that she had a long day. You know, her column was called My Day, and my day happened to be an extremely lengthy day. Yeah, as I said, the more I read about her, I could hardly encompass all the activities that she engaged in. But remember, she was first lady from 32 to 45, so that's 13 years of being very, very prominent in an administration, which was extraordinary. You know, the New Deal and the Depression and World War II, a lot is going on, and Franklin really needs her in certain capacities.
Richard?
Anyway, yes.
I remember as
Yeah,
a young woman, Elinor Roosevelt, she was really a heroine. And I remember I went, she had some kind of there was some kind of an event, and she spoke. And she walked down the aisle. Today I tear up when I think about it. She was so revered, and myself. I mean, she had a standing ovation just from walking into this hall. I don't even remember where it was, but there's no one on earth today in public life, I think, who is revered as she was in those days.
We'll speculate about that. I mean, Michelle is revered.
Yeah, maybe Michelle, yeah, but Michelle didn't do zilch compared to her, as you're talking about.
Yeah, that's the point I'm making. Michelle, you know, did good stuff, but she defined her role as first lady in a much more restrictive fashion. Of course, her husband was able to get around on his own. Just to reinforce your point, Lois, the Gallup polls asked the question, the most admired living woman. You got that? The most admired living woman. From 1948 to 1961, she died in 62. From 1948 to 1961, with the exception of 1 year, Elinor Roosevelt was the most admired living woman.
True.
So I think that
man. I mean, maybe Franklin, but as far as the most admired man, there was nobody that compared to her. No man compared to her and what she accomplished. Think about it. I mean,
but of course, you know, they normally operated in separate spheres, so that you know, there would be, you know, I guess Churchill might have been the most admired at one point, certainly Roosevelt, but Elinor consistently was voted in that way. And very often, just as we see today, I think even during the presidency, Michelle Obama got higher polling numbers than did Barack.
Right.
And Elinor also, for example, in 1940, Elinor had a 67% approval rating, much higher than Franklin did, because the New Deal, as you know, was highly controversial in many quarters. Anything else before we get to the person?
So can I ask you, how do you think Melania compares to her?
I think you've answered the question. Unless you've read the latest, you know, there's a new book out on Melania.
Right.
So I expect you to read it, and we can discuss it next time, okay?
Yeah, no, thank you.
All right, let's try to get below the surface with Elinor. You know, it used to be public figures were revered, were celebrated. You didn't ask what could be embarrassing questions. But history moved on, and historians now began to get beneath the surface, to look at psychological insights. And certainly Elinor has been subject to a fair amount of this investigation. And what have they uncovered? One thing that was well understood then Elinor was subject to repeated bouts of depression. I think from what I've already told you, that is perfectly understandable. She frequently could be found going off by herself to this monument called Grief. I don't know if you've ever visited it. It's in Rocky Creek Park in the District of Columbia. It's a statue commissioned by Henry Adams, executed by Augustus Saint Gaudens in tribute to his wife, who passed away prematurely. It's a very moving statue, and again, it's called Grief. And Elinor at times went off by herself just to contemplate and to sit quietly in front of it to try to get her through some of these periods of depression. As you know, she was orphaned by 10. She had no mother, no father. One of her brothers had died. And beyond that, her mother treated her rather badly. If Joy would show the picture of her mother, it might help explain some part of that. Her mother, Anna, if it's available, you'll see it. In any event, no, that's Elinor. Her mother was considered an extraordinary beauty. I mean, that's what she was known for. She was in the social world. There she is. There she is. Elinor said, and I think you can see why, she was one of the most beautiful women she had ever seen. And Elinor, you may have your opinions about Elinor's looks, but from her mother's perspective, Elinor was at best plain. Here's what Elinor's mother said about Elinor, as recorded by Elinor in one of her autobiographies. "I hardly know what's to happen to you. You're so plain that you really have nothing to do but be good." So her mother called her Granny. Granny. Why did she call her Granny? Because she seemed so plain looking, so without much life, seemingly depressed, like an old woman, even though she was but a child. So her being put down by her mother, not supported by her mother, you know, is part of this story. On the other hand, her father loved her. Her father loved her. They got along well. She couldn't wait to see him. But as you know, he was absent most of the time because he was inebriated. He was sent off to sanitariums. He simply was not around enough to make a difference. When he was around, they got along famously. She loved him to no end. In fact, when her mother died, she expressed little to no grief. In fact, she was rather excited because when her mother died, it meant that her father was coming home to be with her. On the other hand, her father was also a great inspiration. As she recorded in her diary, the thing always to remember, you must do the thing you think you cannot do. That's what her father told her. And one normally, or historians have said that the thing that motivated her was her father's words. You've got to try to do things that you don't think you're capable of achieving. And according to Elinor, these words rang in her ears throughout her life. The other part of the, you might call depression of Elinor had to do, as you know, with her mother-in-law. Here's what her mother-in-law said to the kids, as remembered by Elinor, quote, "Your mother only bore you. I am more your mother than your mother is." So put that into the hopper. In addition, talk about traumatic incidents. They were going over to Europe when she was a 2.5-year-old little girl, and their ship got into a collision with another ship, and a young girl on board who Elinor had encountered was decapitated. And Elinor was thrown into a lifeboat. Terribly traumatic incident when she was 2.5. And from that time on, she never wanted to get into a boat again. She would, because Franklin loved boats. And he would say, "Come on, Elinor, we're going for a cruise," you know. She very reluctantly did so on rare occasions, but that incident when she was a child obviously haunted her for the rest of her life. She was, as I say, also disappointed as a mother, never felt she was adequate. In fact, at one time she wrote, quote, "I'm rather disgusted with myself." Her sons were disappointing to her. One of the things I remember when I was a kid, they used to say, you know, Franklin was this towering figure, this enormous president, and yet his sons never amounted to very much. His 4 sons, who apparently treated him very badly. The record shows they were disrespectful to him. They got along, they tried to use his name, but as I say, they had rather checkered careers. As Elinor pointed out at one time, there were 4 of them, and combined, they had 18 marriages. So I think it kind of confirmed the fact that as a mother, she did not succeed. And then, of course, there was Lucy Mercer, who entered the picture. And then there was Missy Leavitt, who entered the picture. So, you know, if you say there was tragedy, depression in Elinor's life, there's much to point to support that. And yet the real story of Elinor, as many of you know, was the extraordinary resiliency that she displayed. She bounced back at the finishing school. She became a teacher at a private school that she herself founded. The students loved her. She taught English literature and American history. She fell deeply in love with Franklin. Here is one of her letters. Quote, "I am so happy, oh so happy. I love you so dearly. I have never before been known what it's like to be absolutely happy." I mean, they were in love, and you might say, or at least she was in love with him. I haven't read his letters, although as I told you, he evidently was in love, did write love letters, which she then destroyed. When historical figures destroy letters, historians cringe because that is often what we go to get the inside poop. And when they're destroyed, we're deprived of really firsthand accounts of what these personages are thinking. She will destroy another set of letters that I will tell you about a little later, which are also very significant. In any event, the resiliency of Elinor is remarkable. The new role she carved out for herself beginning of the 1920s, the enjoyment in the company of women, the major controversy that currently is in the historical profession has to do with the nature of the relationship of Elinor with Lorena Hickok. The letters are extraordinary. The letters are explicit. The sexual references are frequent. Some historians say that that's the way women often wrote to each other in that fashion. And you shouldn't take it as suggesting a sexual relationship. Other historians say, you got to be kidding. And they cite rather explicit passages about lying together, about kissing. And they say, clearly, this suggests that there was a sexual component. I'm not sure it really matters, other than these days, there is obviously interest in the history of a sexual identification. And if you can get Elinor Roosevelt in that camp, you've achieved something. They later parted. Lorena Hickok found other men to be infatuated with. And I must say, one of the most prominent historians of Elinor, Blanche Wiesen Cook, essentially comes down on the side of that Elinor was she calls her a serial romantic. She had romantic inclinations toward women and also toward men. And there were a number of men in her life, beginning, of course, with Franklin, to whom she became rather emotionally attached. Harry Hopkins, who was in Roosevelt's cabinet, Joseph Lash, who was one of her early biographers, a young man, and also, and I was hinting about this, her bodyguard in later years by the name of Earl Miller, who was a state trooper in New York State. They did everything together for years. He taught her, well, no, she was an expert rider, I must point out, but he taught her how to shoot a gun. They swam together. There's a funny story about Elinor learning how to swim. I think it was in Long Island Sound, and she was visiting her uncle, Teddy Roosevelt, and she admitted that she really didn't know how to swim. So what he did is he pushed her off the dock. That would be a typical Teddy Roosevelt story, acting in that particular fashion. In any event, the relationship of Earl Miller and Elinor Roosevelt for years was extremely close. They did everything together, and she would later destroy the letters between them, suggesting that, there was something there as well. So in terms of resiliency, I think you can see she bounced back in many respects. She was an incredible first lady. All the criticism against her bounced off her. She was subjected to a lot of criticism. What they say about women, she butted in all the time. It was none of her business. A busybody, it's talked too much. In fact, there was a button released in the 1940 presidential campaign which said, "We don't want Elinor either," indicating that, if you voted for Franklin in 40, you'd also get Elinor. Okay, one final section. What was she like? What was she like? You've already gathered as much from what I've said. Physically, she was, I thought she was the tallest president. She was 5'11". But then I read that Michelle Obama is 5'11". So we'd have to put the two of them together and maybe see who is slightly taller than the other. She had buck teeth. You probably remember her teeth being somewhat out of alignment. If you have, Joy, a picture of Elinor when she entered society, well, this is a picture of Elinor. Let me see when that was taken in 1945. There's an earlier picture of her as a debutante, if you can summon that forward. There she is. When she came out into society, coming out. Again, judge for yourself, plain looking, homely. She aged well. She looked like a magnificent woman toward the end, but was deemed by her mother, the beauty, as being plain looking. Whatever that's the case, she was very serious. One of her relatives said, and I quote, "All her life, she yearned to be more spontaneous." She was a compulsive overachiever. She worked. One of her aides said even when she got into a train, she was always working on something. I've already told you she didn't sleep very much. She was, however, remarkably healthy. She never got sick, never had headaches, never came down with any kind of illness. The only thing was, and maybe this is significant, she wore a back brace. She had curvature of the spine, and she wore a back brace as a child for several years. She would never drink. Of course, turns out, as you know, her father was an alcoholic. A brother, the surviving brother, who she was very attached to, died prematurely, was also an alcoholic. She would not gamble. Franklin would say, "Come play poker with the boys," and she would beg off. That was something she did not enjoy. She did not enjoy off-color jokes. She would not drive in the car with Franklin. They built a special car with gears that Franklin could maneuver. She said, "I would never drive with him. He was a lousy driver. He would get us into trouble." Franklin was an avid stamp collector. She had no interest in helping him out with his stamp collection. She was not a cook of any sort. She admitted the most she would ever cook was scrambled eggs. She had little interest in food. As a foodie, she said food and dining was only to provide the setting for conversation. She was a religious Episcopalian. She attended church frequently. Franklin did not. She made her kids go to church. They didn't want to go to church. She maintained a Christmas tradition of reading Dickens's Christmas Carol to her kids. She read it at the UN when she joined there. I don't know what this means, but she spent all year buying Christmas gifts rather than waiting for the last minute. She loved the theater. She often dined at Sardi's after the theater. As I said, she was an accomplished writer. She loved to waltz with her brother. And for a time, Secret Service, because she was such a controversial figure, she also carried a gun, but never had to use it. And turned out she was an accomplished speaker, as many of you know. Rarely did she prepare her speeches. She spoke off the cuff. I would have loved to know what she said at Central, but of course, I don't think we'll ever know, although maybe the local newspaper did carry some portion of her speech. She spoke at the Democratic Convention in 1940, then again. In other words, she is well-rounded, talents galore. So to sum up, what do we take away from the life of Elinor Roosevelt? An inspiration to women. There's life beyond the home. You can remake yourself as she did. You can become, as I've demonstrated, the most admired woman in your country. She wrote an advice column, mostly directed to women. Women would write her, "What should I do? You know, I am facing." Here is one answer. A woman wrote her telling her that her husband had died, and should she go out with other men? You know, what was Roosevelt's thinking on that? And here's how Roosevelt answered. Heavens above, you could decently be seen with other men whenever you feel like going out again. This is your life. I must say, I can't mimic the voice of Elinor. There are some who can, but she did speak in a very high register, in sort of a warble. She took speech lessons and she got better. She spoke clearly as an upper class, almost English means of pronunciation, but her voice was unmistakable. She was a champion of women, as I pointed out, with the press conferences, the advice columns, getting women into the Civilian Conservation Corps, getting women into the factories, being an advocate of birth control, abortion, being this extraordinary first lady. Touring the country, there was a fun cartoon in the Washington Star newspaper. It said, Mrs. Roosevelt spends the night at the White House, namely a rare event, such it was. She was a civil rights pioneer in many, many respects, which I don't have time to go into, other than it was so frequent that J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI kept a file on, and in fact, he tapped her phone. He put speakers under her bed in hotels where he could. Elinor Roosevelt's FBI file totals 3,000 pages. Why was J. Edgar Hoover so upset? Because she hung out with Blacks. She was an advocate of civil rights. She pushed for certain ideas were considered, left-wing, communist, etc. So this aroused the ire of J. Edgar Hoover. So that also should be noted. So as a first lady, as a civil rights pioneer, as an irrepressible liberal, virtually every issue that is still on the agenda, from free public education to healthcare, to housing, to capital punishment, to city planning, to illiteracy. I mean, you name the issue, and Roosevelt was an early advocate of it. And so to call her an irrepressible, in fact, if you would ask today, I would say that she'd probably be a Bernie supporter. She could probably be classified as a democratic socialist at this point. So she was out there. And I think the two events that sum it up, and I'll close with, one of them you probably know, happened in 1939 when the famous Black soprano, Marian Anderson, was scheduled to speak at Constitution Hall, which was a concert hall in Washington, D.C., which was owned by the Daughters of the American Republic. And once she booked it, and they, of course, recognized that she was Black, the DAR canceled her appearance, and she would not be permitted to perform there. Elinor found out about it, intervened, and resigned from the DAR, and saw to it that Anderson would be able to perform in front of the Lincoln Memorial, where 75,000 people turned out to hear her. And we now see just the kind of heroism, the ability to stand up, to challenge public opinion, and to stand up for what she thought was right. And the Marian Anderson incident of '39 is testament to that. Finally, in her later years, she became an avid supporter of Adlai Stevenson, as you know, for president. She backed him in '52, she backed him in '60. She wanted him to run again in 56. She backed him in 60. She later switched and, of course, supported John Kennedy for president. And Stevenson delivered the eulogy at Elinor's funeral. And I think he was either quoting Elinor or quoting a Chinese proverb. I'm not quite sure. But Elinor had said on many occasions, better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. To which he added, her glow has warmed the world. And I think that's a more than adequate tribute to what she accomplished. So that I wouldn't say a nutshell, we stayed here a long time, but that was my reading of Elinor. And I found it illuminating. I learned things that I just didn't know, and I hope I've conveyed at least the essence of what the woman seemed to be like to me and to other historians. So I'd be delighted if you thought there were issues that could be fleshed out or questions about what I've said.
Thank you, Richard.
Richard, when she first started speaking, I thought that she actually did not write things off the cuff, but that Louis Howe was the person who, first of all, he helped her by lowering her voice when she spoke because he said it was too high. But then I thought he was the one who also tutored her in terms of how to do public speaking. I mean, I knew that he had written speeches for her to start out with. I didn't know whether that continued or not. Maybe it didn't. But
no, I would say you're right. I mean, when she is an innocent, when she lacks self-confidence, I'm sure you're right in saying that he mentored her, guided her, probably wrote out at least an outline of what she should cover. But what is remarkable about the woman is how she grew in self-confidence. And of course, at least by midway, she could more than hold her own. She could not possibly have written all the speeches that she had to give. So from what I read, she might either speak off the cuff or make a few notes. But yeah, at the beginning, Louis Howe is her tutor, her guide. He then faded from the scene, was certainly not there in the mid and later years, so she was on her own.
Part of it was that he died.
Yes, he did die, I think in the mid-20s, if I'm correct, but yeah, so.
Because I remember in terms of reading about her, I remember her saying what a tremendous loss it was when he died.
Yeah, they were, they were just like her relationship with Franklin. They were political partners. They, forged a new marital relationship that had to do with what they could each do for each other.
And it's interesting because in the beginning, she disliked him intensely because he was one of FDR's poker playing cronies. They would play poker and they would drink. And she disliked him intensely.
And if you looked at him, he was rather a seedy looking character. But of course, immensely talented, and as you know, was responsible for turning her around and convincing her that after he contracted polio, there could still be a life for her other than being his nurse, which she did religiously in the early years. I mean, she was devoted to him, carried him around to the extent she could in the wheelchair, but then went off on her own at his encouragement to carry his political banner in New York State and then the United States. So it's a remarkable turnaround to the betterment and advantage of both of them. Yeah, Lois? Lois, you've got to unmute yourself. Can you do that, Joy? Can you unmute Lois? Yeah,
I can
Lois.
try. Yeah.
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay. It seems to me, and it's not your fault, Richard, that because she was a woman, there is so much emphasis on her physical appearance. I know that her mother putting her down as homely and all that stuff definitely had an impact on her. But would a man have been judged in what he looked like, or how high or low his voice was? This is, and it continues to this day. And it's amazing in light of the times what she accomplished when you think of how many women are not advanced in the professional world. So I think she was one of the most fascinating and memorable women that we've ever produced in this country. In fact,
Yeah.
many countries.
No, in
But she-
fact, I was giving a talk yesterday about how, and many of you probably saw the movie Bombshell about
Right.
Roger Ailes at Fox News, and
Right.
how he wouldn't put a woman on TV unless he inspected them,
Right.
checked out their physical looks, and then put them on because they were rather pretty. You may notice that the Trump administration also tends to favor pretty women up front as press secretaries or in other capacities. So yeah, you're quite right, Lois, that we would not apply. I mean, it turns out, ironically, that FDR was in fact, Joy, can you put a picture of FDR on for them to see? He was a notably good-looking man as a young man, and this is FDR, I think, in the mid-1930s. He was as you could see, a rather good-looking man. I mean, not that that means anything, but your point about she achieved what she achieved despite what you might consider plain looks, maybe a bit ungainly, maybe a bit stiff, maybe not quite as spontaneous as you might want, but despite that, she was absolutely remarkable given the restraints on women and given her background where she was put down, where her husband cheated on her. I mean, she got up off the ground. I mean, really inspirational, and did everything that I mentioned. And I probably covered 20% of what she managed to achieve.
I just wonder if someone like her today could accomplish the same thing today. Certainly not as the wife of a president. She wouldn't be given all those that reign.
Yeah, what the first ladies went back to is what they take on a particular issue.
Right.
Like Lady Bird Johnson took on beautification, and Bush's wife took on literacy, and Michelle took on a variety of health issues. But Trump's wife took on presumably bullying, but they were all narrowly defined, and certainly nothing like the scope of Elinor. I mean, she stands alone. The only thing comparable, and this was by happenstance, Woodrow Wilson, as you know, suffered a stroke late in his second term. It was not revealed to the public, but by and large, his wife pretty much took over the operations of the government for many, many months until he was sufficiently recovered to be restored. But that was not planned, and of course it was held in confidence, and so you can't compare it to what Elinor did.
Pretty amazing.
Any other thoughts or commentary? Well, as they say, or as Mr. Rogers says, it's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. At least it is up here. I assume that's the case down your way as well. So I enjoyed sharing what I learned about Elinor. If there's interest, we'll try to do this again in some other subject. And thank you all for joining in. And
Thank
for
you,
your
Richard.
questions.
Thank you.
Right.
This was great, Richard. Thank
Richard,
you. Thank you. There's always interest in when you do a lecture because you have so much. You're wonderful. I wish you would keep doing this because it really helps.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's, we're all under some form of house arrest with no immediate prospect of parole. So that getting together periodically is good for me, it's good for you. And if I have something that I think will be of interest to you, I'll point to Joy, and you'll be notified, and probably sooner rather than later, we'll find an occasion to meet again.